Dead America. Tales of the First Month. The Dorm. By Derek Slayton. Chapter 1. Day 0. 7:13 p.m. The harsh fluorescent lighting of the 7th floor hallway in Dormitory Hall B cast an unflattering glow over Brandon as he checked his reflection in his phone camera. He smoothed down his dark brown hair one last time, tucking in a stray strand that refused to cooperate before shoving the device back into his pocket. "Man, would you calm down? You're acting like this is some kind of job interview," Aiden remarked from his sprawled position on Brandon's bed, lazily scrolling through social media. "Easy for you to say," Brandon muttered, turning away from the mirror to face his friend. "You're not the one trying to walk onto the basketball team in 2 weeks. Aiden looked up from his phone, quirking an eyebrow. "What does that have to do with you freaking out about how you look for a dorm mixer?" Brandon sighed, grabbing his wallet from the desk. "Deborah's going to be there." "Ah, there it is," Aiden said with a knowing smirk, sitting up and pocketing his own phone. "Deborah Wilson, the girl you've been staring at in American Lit for the past month without saying more than excuse me when you need to get past her to your seat." "I've said more than that," Brandon protested, though his reddening cheeks betrayed him. "We talked about Thoreau last week." "You asked to borrow her notes," Aiden corrected, standing up and stretching his athletic frame. At 6'2", he was only an inch taller than Brandon, but his natural confidence made him seem more imposing. "That's not talking. That's academic desperation." Brandon grabbed his dorm key, ignoring the jab. "You ready to head down?" "Born ready," Aiden replied, clapping his friend on the shoulder. "Just remember what we've been working on with your shooting form. Keep that elbow in, follow through on your release, and don't hesitate." "Are we talking about basketball or talking to Deborah?" Brandon asked with a half smile. "Both, my friend, both," Aiden grinned. "The principles are the same. Confidence is key." They stepped out into the hallway, closing the door behind them. The corridor stretched the length of the building, doors on both sides leading to identical small rooms housing the hopeful minds of tomorrow. Or, as Aiden often joked, the hangovers of tonight. Music thumped from behind several doors, while from others came the muffled sounds of video games or studying. "Oh wait," Aiden said, stopping suddenly. "I need to check on Brody. He's been sick as a dog the past few days." "Now?" Brandon groaned, checking the time on his phone. "The party's already started." "It'll take 2 seconds, Aiden insisted, already heading toward the far end of the hallway where his room was located. "He's been really bad, some kind of nasty flu. I just want to make sure he hasn't, died or something." Brandon rolled his eyes but followed, knowing there was no point arguing. If there was one thing he'd learned about Aiden in the year they'd been friends, it was that beneath his carefree exterior beat the heart of someone who genuinely cared about others. It was annoying sometimes, but it was also why people gravitated toward him. As they reached Aiden's door, he knocked lightly before pushing it open. "Hey Brody, you still alive in there, buddy?" The room beyond was dark, illuminated only by the glow of a laptop screen. A figure huddled beneath blankets on one of the twin beds shifted slightly at the sound of Aiden's voice. "Unfortunately," came the raspy reply, followed by a wet, hacking cough that made Brandon instinctively take a step back. "Sounds rough," Aiden said, lingering in the doorway. "We're heading down to the mixer. Need anything? Water? Medicine? Food?" "A beer," Brody croaked, before breaking into another coughing fit. Aiden chuckled. "I'll see what I can smuggle back. Get some rest, man." He closed the door and turned back to Brandon. "Poor guy's been like that for 3 days now. Whatever he's got, I really don't want to catch it." "No kidding," Brandon agreed as they headed toward the elevators. "He sounds like he's coughing up a lung." They reached the bank of elevators and Brandon hit the call button. After several seconds with no response, he pressed it again, more firmly this time. "Still out of order," Aiden said, pointing to a handwritten sign taped to the door that Brandon had missed. "Stairs it is." "Again? It's been over a week," Brandon complained. "What's the point of living in a 10-story building if you have to walk up and down 7 flights every time you want to go anywhere?" "Hey, look at it this way," Aiden said as they pushed through the door to the stairwell. "It's good conditioning for your tryout. Coach Brennan loves guys with strong legs." Yeah, Brandon muttered, following Aiden down the concrete steps that echoed with their footfalls. If that were true, the whole basketball team would live on the top floor. "Actually, I think they're mostly in dormitory A," Aiden replied, which, incidentally, has working elevators. Of course it does, Brandon said with a snort. They continued their descent, the sound of the gathering below growing louder with each floor they passed. By the time they reached the ground level, the dull murmur had transformed into a cacophony of music, laughter, and dozens of overlapping conversations. As they pushed through the stairwell door, the full scene came into view. The common area, normally a sparse collection of worn couches and study tables, had been transformed into a proper party space. String lights hung from the ceiling, casting a warm glow over the gathered crowd. In the far corner, a group had claimed the pool tables, while others clustered around the TV area where someone had set up a game console tournament. Near the front windows, which looked out onto the campus's main thoroughfare, a makeshift bar had been established on folding tables, manned by a couple of upperclassmen. Not bad, Aiden remarked, surveying the scene. Looks like George actually put some effort into this one. As if summoned by his name, George, the senior who served as dorm manager, appeared beside them, clipboard in hand. At 22, he carried himself with the weary responsibility of someone much older, the toll of keeping hundreds of freshmen and sophomores in line, evident in the premature lines around his eyes. No alcohol at the bar, he informed them, his tone making it clear this wasn't a suggestion. We've got soda, energy drinks, and some weird punch Rocco made that I've been assured contains nothing that would violate university policy. So, don't think about sneaking your own cocktail into a plastic cup. Wouldn't dream of it, Aiden replied with an innocent smile that fooled no one. We're just here for the scintillating conversation and free snacks. George eyed him skeptically before being called away to deal with another commotion taking place across the room. Come on, Aiden said, nudging Brandon toward the bar. Let's grab something to drink. They weaved through the crowd, Brandon scanning faces as they went. The common area was packed with students, some he recognized from classes, others complete strangers, but he didn't see the one face he was looking for. At the bar, they each grabbed a cup of the mysterious punch, which turned out to taste like a bizarre mixture of fruit juice and what Brandon suspected might be cold brew coffee. It wasn't good, but it was free and caffeinated, which seemed to be the primary criteria for most of the attendees. Looking for someone? Aiden asked with a knowing smirk as Brandon continued to survey the room. Before Brandon could respond with a denial, Aiden's face lit up. There she is. Your literary crush, 3 o'clock. Brandon turned, trying to appear casual, and immediately spotted Deborah near one of the couches. Her dark hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail, a few strands framing her face as she laughed at something her friend Pamela had said. She wore a simple green sweater over jeans, nothing fancy, but Brandon felt his mouth go dry all the same. Go talk to her, Aiden urged, giving him a slight push. What do I even say? Brandon hissed, suddenly forgetting every word in the English language. How about hello? It's a classic opener for a reason, Aiden rolled his eyes. Come on, I'll be your wingman. Before Brandon could protest further, Aiden was already moving through the crowd toward the two women, forcing Brandon to follow or be left behind. As they approached, Deborah looked up, her expression brightening slightly in recognition. Hey there, Aiden greeted them smoothly. Mind if we join you? Free country, Pamela replied with a shrug, but the small smile that followed took any sting out of her words. Brandon managed a nod in greeting, trying desperately to remember any of the conversation starters he'd practiced in his head. You're in Dr. Mercer's American Lit, right? Deborah asked, saving him from his own awkwardness. Yeah, Brandon replied, relief washing over him. Thanks again for the notes last week, they really helped. No problem, Deborah smiled. His lectures get pretty dense sometimes. Dense is putting it mildly, Brandon said, finding his voice. I thought I was going to need a dictionary just to understand his comments on my last paper. Deborah laughed, the sound making Brandon's chest tighten in a not entirely unpleasant way. Did he use perspicacious on yours too? I had to look that one up. Brandon began, but was cut off by a commotion from across the room. Woo, party time! All heads turned to see Rocco, a sophomore known for his boisterous antics, standing on top of one of the couches. Before anyone could stop him, he yanked off his shirt and began beating his chest like an ape, howling loud enough to momentarily drown out the music. $10 says George writes him up again, Pamela commented dryly. Sure enough, George was already making his way across the room, his clipboard clutched like a weapon as he prepared to deal with yet another Rocco situation. "Some things never change," Aiden remarked. "Hey, I saw they set up some board games in the corner. Anyone interested?" "I could go for some Monopoly," Deborah replied, standing up. "Fair warning, though, I show no mercy." "Monopoly's a relationship ender," Pamela said, joining her. "Let's play something less likely to result in bloodshed." "I'm game for whatever," Brandon said, relieved to have a structured activity to focus on rather than trying to make conversation. The four of them began making their way across the common area toward the game tables, navigating around clusters of students. As they neared the front of the building, the large windows offered a view of the street beyond, dimly lit by the campus lampposts. Brandon was about to suggest Scrabble when something outside caught his eye. Headlights approaching much too fast down the campus road that ran directly in front of their building. "What the?" he began, stopping in his tracks as the vehicle swerved erratically, mounting the curb and aiming straight for the building's entrance. "Look out," Brandon shouted, instinct taking over, as he grabbed Deborah's arm and yanked her backward, away from the windows. Aiden reacted just as quickly, pulling Pamela in the opposite direction, separating the group as they scrambled for safety. Time seemed to slow as the headlights grew blindingly bright, illuminating the shocked faces of students who had yet to register the danger. There was a heartbeat of horrified silence, a collective inhale of disbelief, before the sound of screeching tires filled the air. The car, a sedan Brandon would later recall as being dark blue or black, smashed through the large front windows of Dormitory Hall B, sending glass and metal exploding inward like deadly shrapnel. It careened into the common area, crushing furniture and scattering students in its path, before finally coming to a rest in the center of the room amid screams of terror and pain. Chapter 2. The wrecked sedan sat in the middle of the common room, its engine still roaring at full throttle. Despite the collision and ensuing damage, the driver continued flooring the accelerator, causing the RPMs to climb higher and higher. Only one tire spun uselessly against the debris-covered floor. The rest rendered non-functional by the impact, producing a high-pitched squeal that competed with the screams of injured students. Brandon pulled himself up from the ground, heart pounding in his chest. The force with which he'd yanked Deborah away from the windows had sent them both tumbling to the floor, but it had saved them from being in the direct path of the vehicle. "Are you okay?" he asked, extending his hand to help her up. Deborah took his hand, wincing slightly as she rose to her feet. "I think so." Her voice trembled as she brushed glass fragments from her clothes. "Just a few scrapes." The scene before them was one of absolute chaos. The front entrance of Dormitory Hall B had been utterly destroyed. The large windows that once lined the facade now reduced to jagged frames and scattered shards. The glow of nearby streetlights streamed through the gaping hole where the car had entered, illuminating the destruction in harsh detail. Several students lay on the floor where the car had plowed through. Some writhed in pain, crying out for help, while others remained disturbingly still. Those who had escaped the direct path of the vehicle were either frozen in shock or rushing to aid their fallen classmates. Blood had already begun to pool beneath the most severely injured, spreading across the tile floor in dark, glistening puddles. The metallic scent hung heavy in the air, mixing with the smell of burned rubber and gasoline. "Aiden?" Brandon called out, scanning the room for his friend. Fear gripped him as he realized they'd been separated in the chaos. "Aiden!" "Over here," came the reply from the other side of the wrecked sedan. "We're okay. Pamela's with me." Relief washed over Brandon. At least his friend and Pamela had managed to avoid the car's destructive path. He turned back toward the vehicle, curiosity drawing him closer despite the danger. As he approached the rear bumper, he noticed movement inside. The driver was thrashing about in the seat in jerky, unnatural motions. Brandon stared at it in confusion. For someone who had just crashed at high speed, the driver seemed strangely animated rather than injured or dazed. Their movements were erratic, almost inhuman, as if they were having some kind of seizure. A student Brandon didn't recognize rushed to the driver's side, calling out, "Hey, are you okay in there?" He reached for the door handle, intent on helping. "Wait," Brandon shouted. "Don't open that door." His warning came too late. The moment the door swung open, Two bloodied hands shot out from the vehicle, grabbing the would-be rescuer by his shirt. The student barely had time to register what was happening before he was yanked violently toward the driver. The young woman behind the wheel, her face covered in blood, eyes vacant and feral, lunged forward with inhuman speed. Her teeth sank into the student's neck, tearing through flesh with savage efficiency. Blood sprayed from the wound as the victim screamed, a sound of pure terror and agony that cut through the chaos of the room. "Oh my God," someone shrieked nearby. Panic erupted throughout the common area. Two other students rushed forward, one grabbing the bitten student and trying to pull him away while the other slammed the car door shut, trapping the crazed driver inside. Blood poured from the victim's neck as his friends lowered him to the floor, their hands pressed against the wound in a futile attempt to stop the bleeding. "Someone call 911, a voice shouted from across the room. Several students immediately pulled out their phones, frantically dialing for help. Brandon could hear snippets of their desperate attempts. "It's not going through. I can't get a connection. What's happening?" The wounded student convulsed on the floor, his movements becoming weaker as blood continued to pump from the gaping wound in his neck. His friends' faces were masks of horror as they realized there was nothing they could do to save him. Inside the car, the driver continued to thrash, slamming against the windows with unnatural strength. Her mouth was smeared with fresh blood, teeth bared in what looked like hunger rather than pain or fear. The sight sent chills down Brandon's spine. It was like something from a horror movie, not something that happened in real life. Aiden and Pamela made their way over to Brandon and Deborah, navigating around the growing crowd of stunned onlookers. "Did you see that?" Aiden asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His usually confident demeanor had vanished, replaced by stunned disbelief. "She just bit him, tore his throat open like an animal." "What's wrong with her?" Pamela asked, her face pale with shock. Before anyone could respond, new screams erupted from the front of the building. Brandon turned to see several figures rushing in through the shattered entrance, people moving with the same jerky, unnatural gait as the driver. Their clothes were torn and bloodied, their faces contorted in expressions of mindless hunger. "Oh no," Deborah whispered, instinctively stepping closer to Brandon. "There are more of them." The newcomers collided with students who had been heading for the exit, unaware of the approaching danger. The attack was immediate and brutal. The intruders bit and clawed at anyone within reach, tackling students to the floor with a feral ferocity. Blood sprayed across walls and furniture as the attackers tore into their victims. Those who weren't immediately grabbed tried to fight back or flee, their panicked shouts adding to the sound of confused terror that filled the room. A girl near the entrance screamed as one of the creatures latched onto her arm, teeth sinking into flesh. A young man tried to help her only to be tackled by another attacker. "We need to get out of here," Brandon said, instinctively taking Deborah's hand. "The stairwell, now!" The four of them began moving toward the stairwell door on the far side of the common area, weaving around overturned furniture and panicked students. Behind them, screams intensified as the attackers, zombies, though Brandon could hardly believe he was thinking the word, fell upon more victims. Some brave or foolish students stood their ground, trying to fight off the creatures with chairs, pool cues, anything they could grab. Their efforts seemed to buy time for others to escape, but the attackers showed no sign of pain or fatigue. Each time one was knocked down, it would simply rise again, more determined than before. The creatures only made it halfway across the room, distracted by the students who stood their ground or were too slow to escape. The sickening sounds of tearing flesh and screams of agony followed Brandon's group as they moved toward the exit. As they neared the stairwell, a familiar voice called out over the chaos. "Hey, over here." Brandon turned to see George, crouched behind the reception desk in the center of the room. The dorm manager was waving frantically, trying to get their attention. Beside him, Rocco, now with his shirt back on, and two other students Brandon didn't recognize were huddled in hiding. "Come on," Brandon shouted, motioning toward the stairwell. "You have to run for it." George shook his head, his eyes wide with fear as he glanced at the creatures roaming between them and safety. The others behind the desk looked equally terrified, unwilling to leave their makeshift shelter. "They're not moving," Deborah whispered urgently. "We can't wait for them." Brendan hesitated, looking back at the huddled group, He couldn't just leave them there, but each second they delayed put their own group at greater risk. Aiden stepped forward, his expression hardening as he made a clear hand signal, slashing his hand across his throat, followed by pointing at their hiding spot. The message was unmistakable. Stay there, and you're dead. This seemed to galvanize George. He nodded tensely, then whispered something to the others. After a brief huddle, they prepared themselves to move. Now, Aiden called to them, run, now! The four of them burst from behind the desk, sprinting toward the stairwell where Brandon's group waited. Their sudden movement and the sound of their footfalls immediately drew attention from the nearest zombies, who turned away from their current victims and began pursuing the new prey with frightening speed. George led the way, with Rocco and the two unnamed students close behind. They had covered half the distance when disaster struck. George's foot caught on an overturned chair, sending him sprawling onto the floor with a heavy thud. "George!" Rocco shouted, skidding to a halt beside his fallen friend. Without hesitation, Rocco grabbed George by the back of his shirt, hauling him back to his feet with surprising strength. The brief delay proved costly. The pursuing zombies closed the gap, tackling the two unnamed students to the ground from behind. Their screams cut through the air as the creatures swarmed over them, tearing into flesh with savage hunger. One of the students, a young woman with short blonde hair, reached out desperately toward Rocco as a zombie sank its teeth into her shoulder. The other student didn't even have time to cry out before multiple attackers descended on him. "Run!" Brandon shouted from the stairwell door. "Don't look back!" George and Rocco broke into a renewed sprint, the creatures right behind them. Their faces were masks of terror as they crossed the final few yards to safety, the sounds of their dying companions haunting each step. They reached the stairwell mere seconds before the zombies, barreling through the door that Brandon held open. Their momentum carried them several steps up the stairs before they turned back, gasping for breath. "Close it!" Rocco shouted, his voice hoarse with exertion and fear. Brandon and Aiden grabbed the heavy metal door, trying to pull it shut, but several zombies had reached it too quickly. Bloodied hands and arms wedged into the gap, preventing the door from closing completely. The creatures pushed against the other side, their combined strength making it nearly impossible for the students to pull the door closed. "Pull harder," Aiden grunted, his face red with exertion as he yanked on the door handle with all his might. Brandon strained against the door, feeling it give slightly as the zombies on the other side continued to pull. The gap began to widen as more creatures pressed forward, their moans and the sound of their hands slapping against the metal creating a nightmarish chorus. Through the opening, Brandon could see more zombies approaching, drawn by the commotion. Deborah and Pamela stood further up the stairs, watching in horror as the boys struggled with the door. George had slumped against the wall, still trying to catch his breath after his near-death experience. "We can't hold it," Brandon shouted, his arms burning with the effort of pulling against the combined strength of the creatures. Rocco, having recovered slightly, grabbed the door as well, adding his strength to the effort. But even with three of them pulling, the zombies on the other side were slowly winning the battle, forcing the gap wider, inch by inch. Brandon caught glimpses of snarling faces through the opening, bloodied hands clawing at the air as they tried to reach the fresh prey just beyond their grasp. The stench of death and decay wafted through the gap, making his stomach turn. "If they get through, we're done for," Aiden grunted, his arms trembling with the effort of holding the door. The gap widened further, allowing a zombie's head to push partially through. Its teeth snapped at the air just inches from Rocco's arm, causing him to flinch back in terror. The momentary shift in weight allowed the door to open even wider, and now multiple arms were reaching through, grasping blindly for the survivors. Chapter 3. "Hold it!" Brandon shouted, his knuckles white from gripping the release bar of the stairwell door. The metal pressed painfully into his palms as he strained to keep the zombies from pulling it open. Beside him, Aiden grunted with exertion, his face flushed with effort. Rocco had backed away from the door, eyes wide with terror as more zombies pressed against the other side, their moans growing louder as they sensed fresh prey just beyond their reach. "Rocco!" Brandon yelled, snapping the other student out of his daze. "Get your ass back on this door now!" Rocco blinked, then lunged forward, adding his strength to the effort once more. Even with three of them pulling, the door continued to shudder under the relentless assault from the other side. "We can't stay here," Aiden called over his shoulder to George and the girls. "We need someplace to go. The sooner the better." Deborah and Pamela exchanged a quick glance before Pamela nodded decisively. "We'll check the floors above us," she said, already moving up the stairs with Deborah right behind her. The two young women sprinted up to the second-floor landing. Deborah pressed her ear against the door, eyes widening at the sounds of chaos coming from the other side. "I hear screaming," she whispered. Pamela steeled herself before carefully pulling the door open just enough to peek through. What she saw made her heart sink. Zombies swarmed the hallway, some feasting on fallen students, others stalking through the corridor searching for more victims. Blood painted the walls in grotesque patterns, and the air was thick with agonized screams and inhuman moans. "No good," she hissed, letting the door close. "It's overrun." Without hesitation, they continued upward, the sounds of the struggle below pushing them faster. As they reached the third floor, the stairwell was eerily quiet compared to the floors below. The absence of screams or moans was both relieving and unsettling. Pamela approached the door cautiously, listening intently before cracking it open. The hallway beyond was empty and quiet, the fluorescent lights casting their harsh glow on the vacant corridor. "Third floor is clear," she shouted down the stairwell. Brandon heard the call and immediately took charge. "George, Rocco, get up to the third floor now." George didn't need to be told twice. He dashed up the stairs, with Rocco hesitating only long enough to look questioningly at Brandon. "Go," Brandon ordered. "We're right behind you." As Rocco joined the others on the third floor, Brandon and Aiden remained at the door, their legs now braced against the wall to give them more leverage. The zombies continued to pull from the other side, their relentless strength showing no signs of fatigue. "We can't hold it much longer," Aiden said, his voice strained. "We need to make a break for it," Brandon replied. "When I count to 3, you let go first and run for the stairs. I'll be right behind you." Aiden shook his head, "Not leaving you here alone." "It'll only be for a second and I can hold it that long," Brandon insisted. "These things move fast. We need to be faster. And the last thing I want to do is die because I tripped over you while trying to run up the stairs." Aiden hesitated, reluctance written across his face, but finally nodded. "Fine, but if you're not right behind me, I'm coming back for you." "Deal," Brandon said, readjusting his grip on the door. "Ready? 1, 2, 3. Aiden released his hold on the door and sprinted for the stairs. The sudden shift in weight nearly yanked the door from Brandon's grasp, but he managed to maintain his grip, muscles straining as he held back the full force of the creatures alone. As soon as Aiden's foot hit the first step, Brandon let go and bolted after him. The door burst open behind them and the zombies poured into the stairwell, their moans echoing off the concrete walls as they gave chase. The creatures scrambled over each other in their haste, several of them tripping and falling, creating a momentary obstacle for those behind them. That brief stumble was all the advantage Brandon and Aiden needed. They flew up the stairs, taking them 2 at a time, the sounds of pursuit driving them forward with newfound energy. They reached the third-floor landing where the others were waiting, hands outstretched to pull them through the door. As soon as they cleared the threshold, Brandon and Aiden spun around, grabbing the door and yanking it shut, just as the first of the zombies reached the landing. The heavy metal door slammed closed, the sound reverberating through the hallway. Brandon and Aiden kept their hands firmly on the release bar, ready to hold it if the zombies tried to pull it open from the other side. "Do they not know how to use doors?" Pamela asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The creatures banged against the metal, their fists creating a cacophony of dull thuds, but none of them attempted to use the handle. After several tense moments, Brandon's shoulders relaxed. Slightly. "I guess they don't have the intelligence to work the door," he said, though he maintained his grip just in case. "Must be freshmen," Rocco quipped, prompting the rest of the group to give him a disapproving look. "What? Tell me I'm wrong." The group shook their collective heads before falling into silence, each trying to catch their breath and process what had just happened. The hallway around them was quiet, a stark contrast to what was just on the other side of the stairwell door. "What the hell is going on?" George finally asked, his voice trembling slightly. "Those people, they're like something out of a horror movie." "It's like they're zombies or something," Rocco added, running a hand through his sweat-drenched hair. "That's impossible," Pamela said, though her tone lacked conviction. "Zombies aren't real." "Tell that to them," Aiden replied grimly, nodding toward the door where the pounding continued. Brandon took a deep breath, trying to think clearly despite the adrenaline still coursing through his system. "Whatever they are, they're dangerous. We need to figure out what to do next." "We should try to find a phone that works," Deborah suggested. "Call for help." "And where would that help come from?" George asked. "You saw what happened downstairs. This isn't just here, it's everywhere." Before anyone could respond, a distant scream cut through their discussion, coming from somewhere down the hallway. They all froze, heads turning toward the sound. "Someone's in trouble," Brandon said, already moving in that direction. "Wait," Aiden hissed, grabbing his arm. "We need to be careful." Brandon nodded, motioning for the others to follow as he moved cautiously down the hallway. The screams grew louder as they approached, accompanied by the sounds of a struggle coming from behind one of the dorm room doors. They were about 20 feet away when the door suddenly flew open. A male student stumbled backward into the hallway, his shirt soaked in blood from multiple bite wounds across his chest and arms. He collapsed against the wall, sliding down to the floor, his eyes wide with terror and pain. "Help me," he gasped, blood bubbling from his lips. Before anyone could move to assist him, another figure appeared in the doorway, a student with blood smeared across his face and neck, eyes vacant and feral. The zombified roommate let out a growl before pouncing on the injured student, teeth immediately sinking into his exposed throat. Brandon's eyes darted to the wall beside him where a fire extinguisher hung in its bracket. Without hesitation, he yanked it free, the metal cold and heavy in his hands. The sound of the extinguisher being removed from its mounting drew the attention of the attacking zombie. It lifted its head, blood dripping from its chin, and fixed its milky eyes on the group. With a snarl, it rose to its feet and charged. Brandon stepped forward, positioning himself between the creature and his friends. As the zombie closed the distance, Brandon swung the extinguisher upward with all his strength, catching the creature under the chin. The impact lifted the zombie off its feet, sending it crashing back to the ground. Not giving it time to recover, Brandon followed through with brutal efficiency. He brought the extinguisher down on the zombie's skull, the metal canister making a sickening crunch as it connected. Again and again he struck, each impact more devastating than the last, until the creature finally went still, dark fluid pooling beneath its shattered head. Brandon stood over the body, chest heaving, the bloodied extinguisher still clutched in his trembling hands. "Are you okay?" Deborah asked, moving to his side and placing a gentle hand on his arm. Brandon nodded, unable to find words as the reality of what he'd just done sank in. He had killed someone, or something that had once been someone. The thought was both horrifying and necessary, a contradiction his mind struggled to reconcile. While they were focused on Brandon, Pamela had rushed to check on the bitten student. She knelt beside him, reaching out to feel for a pulse in his neck. "If he's alive, it's not by much," Pamela called back. The student's eyes were unfocused, his breathing shallow and labored. Blood continued to pump from the wounds in his neck and chest, spreading across the floor in a widening pool. His movements grew weaker with each passing second as life drained from his body. Suddenly, the student went completely still, his chest no longer rising and falling. Pamela leaned closer, trying to detect any signs of life. "I think he's gone," she said softly, beginning to back away. The group stood there in silence for several moments, struggling to process what was happening right in front of them. Without warning, the student's eyes snapped open, now clouded with the same vacant look they had seen in the other zombies. His hand shot out with impossible speed, grasping for Pamela's arm. "Look out!" Aiden shouted, lunging forward and yanking Pamela backward, just as the newly reanimated zombie's teeth snapped shut where her wrist had been a moment before. The creature clambered to its knees, mouth open in a hungry snarl as it prepared to lunge again. Brandon was already moving, the fire extinguisher raised high. With a grunt of effort, he brought it down on the zombie's head, the impact crushing its skull and ending its second life before it had truly begun. Brandon stumbled back, dropping the now dented extinguisher to the floor with a clatter. The hallway fell silent except for their ragged breathing and the distant sounds of chaos from elsewhere in the building. "That was too close," Aiden said, his arm still protectively around Pamela's shoulders. "It happened so fast," Pamela whispered, staring at the corpse on the floor. He died and then just came back. This is insane, George muttered, running a hand over his face. How is this happening? Brandon looked at the door to the dorm room, which stood partially open. In here, he said, moving toward it. We need somewhere to catch our breath and figure out what to do next. They filed into the room, Brandon carefully pulling the door shut behind them. The dorm room was a typical double, with 2 beds, desks, and dressers, though one side was now splattered with blood. A laptop on one of the desks still displayed what looked like an online game, the character standing motionless in a colorful fantasy world that seemed absurdly distant from their current reality. Rocco collapsed onto the clean bed, head in his hands, while George paced nervously by the door. Aiden guided Pamela to the desk chair, his concern for her evident in every gesture. Deborah moved to the window, looking out at the campus below. "Oh my God," she gasped, pressing her hand against the glass. "You need to see this." The others joined her, crowding around the window to get a view of the street beneath them. The campus, usually peaceful at night with its well-lit pathways and manicured lawns, had descended into complete chaos. Dozens of zombies swarmed across the open spaces, chasing fleeing students and faculty. Screams carried up to them even through the closed window, the sounds of terror and pain piercing the night air. Cars were crashed at odd angles along the road, some with their headlights still on, illuminating the nightmarish scenes playing out in their beams. My God, it's everywhere. Chapter 4. The 6 survivors huddled in the dorm room, each processing the chaos unfolding around them in their own way. Brandon remained by the window, watching the campus descend further into madness as the minutes ticked by. The distant wail of sirens competed with screams and the occasional sound of breaking glass. "This can't be happening," Deborah whispered, sitting on the edge of the clean bed, her fingers nervously twisting a strand of her dark hair. George paced by the door, occasionally pressing his ear against it to listen for any movement in the hallway. Rocco had taken up residence in the desk chair, spinning it in anxious half-circles, while Pamela leaned against the wall, arms wrapped around herself as if for protection. Aiden stood beside Brandon at the window, his face grim as he surveyed the carnage below. "We should call for help," Pamela suggested, pulling out her phone. The others did the same, each dialing 911 with varying degrees of hope. "Nothing but busy signals," Aiden reported after his 3rd attempt. "Same here," Rocco added, tossing his phone onto the bed in frustration. Brandon shook his head. "All circuits are busy. We're on our own, at least for the time being." "I can't believe this is happening," Deborah said, her voice barely audible. "How did it get so bad so quickly?" "The party wasn't even that packed," Pamela observed. "Usually those gatherings are packed wall to wall." George nodded, pausing his pacing. Attendance was way down tonight. A lot of people have been sick this week. "There's been some kind of flu going around campus," he continued. "At least half the building was complaining about symptoms as of this morning. I had to fill out reports for the health center." Aiden's attention was drawn to the far side of the dorm room, where a small desk was covered with used tissues, cold medicine bottles, and an empty bottle of water. "Looks like someone in here was sick too," he observed. Rocco's head snapped up, eyes widening with sudden realization. What if all the sick people are turning into those things? "That doesn't make any sense," Pamela argued. "People get sick all the time. They don't turn into zombies." "Do you have a better explanation?" Rocco countered, leaning forward in his chair. "It's not a coincidence that everyone's getting sick right before people start eating each other." "It could be some kind of virus," Deborah suggested quietly. "Something that makes people violent." "Or a government experiment gone wrong," Rocco added, his voice rising with each word. "They're always messing with stuff they shouldn't be. Biological weapons and—" "Enough!" Brandon's voice cut through the speculative chatter. He turned from the window to face the group, his expression stern. "It doesn't matter what caused this. What matters is that it's happening, and we need to focus on staying alive." "The hell it doesn't matter," Rocco shot back. "If sick people are what's causing this, then we're in serious trouble. George just said half the building is sick. That means we're right in the middle of the shit." Aiden stepped forward, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Rocco's agitation. "My roommate's been sick for the past 3 days. High fever, coughing, the works. He's up on the 7th floor. If you want to test your theory, we can go check on him." "Are you insane?" Pamela objected. "The elevator's out of order and the stairwell is full of those things. We barely made it to this floor." "What about the other stairwell?" Brandon suggested. "The one at the opposite end of the hallway. It might be clear." Rocco jumped to his feet. "I'll check," he volunteered, already moving toward the door. "Be right back." "Be careful," Deborah called after him as he slipped out into the hallway. With Rocco gone, the room fell into an uneasy silence, broken only by George's renewed pacing. "Even if we can get to the 7th floor, where do we go after that?" Pamela asked. "We can't just hide in a dorm room forever." "She's right," Aiden agreed. "These rooms are too small, and we don't have enough food or water to last more than a day at most." Brandon considered this, his mind racing through the limited options available to them. "What about the top floor? There's that student cafeteria up there." George nodded, his expression brightening slightly. "That could work. It's not much, but they keep it stocked with ramen, snacks, microwave meals, enough to feed late-night studiers. And it has those large tables we could use to barricade the doors," Deborah added, warming to the idea. "Plus, being on the top floor means we'd only have to defend from one direction," Aiden pointed out. "No one's going to be coming through the ceiling." Their planning was interrupted by Rocco's return. He slipped back inside, closing the door quietly behind him. "There are zombies in the other stairwell too," he reported, "but it sounds like there are fewer than in the one we came up. Maybe just 1 or 2. Brandon nodded, moving over to one of the beds and began stripping off the sheets. His actions garnered the attention of the others in the room, confusion painting their faces. "What are you doing?" Deborah asked, watching as he grabbed the thin twin mattress, testing its weight. "Making a shield," Brandon replied, turning the mattress in his hands. It was light enough for him to maneuver, but sturdy enough to create a barrier between them and any attacking zombies. "If something comes at us from above, I can use this to hold them back while the rest of you take them out." "That's actually pretty smart," Aiden admitted, picking up the dented fire extinguisher from where Brandon had dropped it earlier. "We should all grab something to defend ourselves." The others quickly followed suit. Pamela and Deborah each took a heavy textbook from the desk, while George found a metal desk lamp, unscrewing the shade to leave just the heavy base and pole. Rocco grabbed a chair, holding it by the back like a lion tamer. "Remember, aim for the head," Brandon instructed as they positioned themselves by the door. "That looks like it's a surefire way to put them down for good." They gathered in the hallway, moving as a tight unit toward the stairwell door. Brandon took the lead with his mattress shield, followed closely by Aiden with the fire extinguisher at the ready. The others fell in behind them, their makeshift weapons clutched tightly. "Ready?" Brandon asked, his hand on the door handle. 5 tense nods answered him. With a deep breath, he pushed the door open and they rushed into the stairwell. The sound of their entrance echoed in the concrete shaft, immediately followed by a chorus of moans from both above and below. Brandon barely had time to position the mattress before a zombie appeared on the landing above, its vacant eyes fixing on the new prey. It charged down the stairs, arms outstretched, mouth open in a hungry snarl. "Incoming!" Brandon shouted, bracing the mattress against the attack. The zombie slammed into the makeshift shield with surprising force, nearly knocking Brandon backward. He held firm, using his weight to push the creature back against the wall of the landing, pinning it in place. "Aiden!" he called out, struggling to maintain his hold as the zombie thrashed against the barrier. Aiden was there in an instant, swinging the fire extinguisher with all his might. The metal canister connected with the zombie's head with a sickening crack, and the creature went limp, sliding down the wall to the floor. Below them, more zombies had begun climbing the stairs, drawn by the commotion. Rocco and George moved to the edge of the landing, waiting for the creatures to reach them. "Wait until they're close," Brandon ordered, repositioning his mattress for the next threat. The first zombie reached the top step, lunging forward with outstretched arms. Rocco thrust his chair forward, catching the creature in the chest and momentarily halting its advance. George followed up with a powerful kick, sending the zombie tumbling backward down the stairs. It crashed into the ones following behind, and they all went down in a tangle of limbs. "Go!" Brandon shouted. "Up to the 7th floor, now!" They rushed up the stairs, Brandon taking the rear position with his mattress shield to guard against pursuit. The zombies below were already untangling themselves, their moans growing louder as they resumed their climb. By the time they reached the 7th floor, they could hear the creatures just a flight below them. Brandon yanked open the door, and they piled through, closing it firmly behind them. The 7th floor hallway was eerily quiet compared to the stairwell. Flickering fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows along the corridor, which stretched in both directions from where they stood. "Which way to your room?" Brandon asked Aiden, keeping his voice low. "Left, down at the end," Aiden replied, already moving in that direction. The others followed close behind, eyes darting nervously to the doors they passed, half expecting zombies to burst out at any moment. When they reached the door to room 713, Aiden hesitated, his hand raised to knock. "Brody?" he called softly. "Brody, you in there, man?" The response was immediate and chilling. A series of thuds and scratches erupted from the other side of the door, accompanied by a familiar, inhuman moan. Something slammed against the wood with enough force to make the hinges rattle. "Jesus," Rocco muttered, taking a step back. Aiden stood frozen, staring at the door as it shuddered under the assault from within. The sound of his roommate, or what had once been his roommate, trying to break through to reach them, confirmed their worst fears. "He's turned," Aiden said, his voice hollow with disbelief. "Rocco was right. The sickness, it's turning people." Brandon placed a hand on his friend's shoulder, squeezing gently. "I'm sorry, Aiden." For a moment, Aiden didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the door as if he could somehow see through it to the person who had shared his living space for months. Then he straightened, his expression hardening. "We need to get to the top floor," he said, his voice steadier than before. "There's nothing we can do for him now." Brandon nodded, understanding the mixture of grief and resolve in his friend's eyes. "Let's go," he said, turning back toward the stairwell. "We don't have much time." Chapter 5. The door to the stairwell shuddered as several zombies on the other side pounded against it. Their moans filtered through the metal, sending a chill down the spines of the 6 survivors gathered in the hallway. The relentless assault against the door made it clear that the creatures knew exactly where their potential prey was hiding. "What do we do?" George whispered, clutching his makeshift weapon tightly. Rather than engaging in debate, Brandon stepped forward, dropping to one knee as he positioned the mattress firmly against the door. The thin twin mattress wasn't much protection, but it would provide enough of a barrier between them and the hungry creatures on the other side. "Aiden, Rocco," Brandon called out, nodding for them to take up positions behind him. "Be ready to strike as soon as they push through." The two stepped forward, Aiden with his fire extinguisher and Rocco clutching a metal desk lamp. Both positioned themselves on either side of Brandon, weapons raised and ready to strike. "Pamela, Deborah, George, stand back," Brandon instructed. "If any get past us, run back to my dorm room." Brandon reached into his pocket and tossed his keys over to George before turning and nodding to Aiden, who reached for the door handle. "On 3, he said quietly. 1, 2, 3. Aiden pushed the door open just enough for the zombies to grab hold of it. The creatures immediately seized the opportunity, yanking the door wider. Brandon braced himself, pushing the mattress firmly against the opening. 2 zombies pressed against the barrier, their hands clawing at the edges, trying to reach the fresh meat just beyond. "Now!" Brandon shouted, struggling to hold the mattress steady as the zombies pushed against it with surprising strength. Aiden swung the fire extinguisher hard, connecting with the head of the first zombie that managed to reach around the mattress. The impact sent it staggering sideways, but it quickly recovered, lunging forward again with renewed aggression. Rocco stepped in, swinging his lamp from above, the heavy base crashing down on the creature's skull with enough force to drop it instantly. The second zombie continued to push against the mattress, its dead eyes fixed on Brandon with predatory focus. Aiden adjusted his grip on the extinguisher and struck again, this time landing a perfect hit that caved in the side of the zombie's head. It collapsed beside its companion, dark fluid pooling beneath both bodies. "Check for more," Brandon instructed, still holding the mattress in place as Aiden cautiously peered through the gap. "Clear," Aiden reported after a tense moment. "Just these 2. Brandon lowered the mattress with a relieved sigh. "Let's move them out of the way and get to the top floor." Together they dragged the bodies clear of the door, leaving dark smears on the concrete landing. No one spoke as they worked, everyone wanting to get the job done without thinking about it. With the path clear, they began their ascent to the 10th floor, Brandon once again taking the lead with his mattress shield. The stairwell was eerily quiet now, though the distant sounds of chaos from the lower floors remained a constant reminder of the danger that surrounded them. As they reached the final landing, Brandon paused, raising a hand to signal the others to stop. He pressed his ear against the door to the 10th floor, listening intently. "I hear movement," he whispered. "At least 2 of them." "We can handle 2, Aiden replied, tightening his grip on the extinguisher. Brandon nodded, repositioning his mattress. "Same plan as before. I'll block, you strike." The group gathered around the door, tension written across their faces as they prepared for another confrontation. Brandon counted down silently with his fingers. 3, 2, 1, before pushing the door open. The cafeteria beyond was brightly lit, bathing the space in light. 2 figures lurched near the far end, their movements stiff and uncoordinated. At the sound of the door opening, they immediately turned, vacant eyes locking onto the survivors. With hungry moans, they began racing forward, their pace quickening with each step. "Go," Brandon ordered, holding the door wide as Aiden and Rocco charged through. The 2 met the zombies halfway across the room. Aiden struck first, a powerful swing of the extinguisher, catching the nearest creature in the shoulder, spinning it around. Before it could recover, he delivered a second blow to the back of its head, sending it crashing to the floor. Rocco faced off against the second zombie, a female student whose face was covered in dried blood. He swung his lamp, but the creature ducked beneath the blow with surprising agility. It lunged forward, hands grasping for Rocco's throat, but Aiden was there in an instant, bringing his extinguisher down on its head with a sickening crunch. "Thanks," Rocco gasped, stumbling backward. "Don't mention it," Aiden replied, scanning the room for additional threats. "Looks clear." Brandon ushered the others inside, closing the door firmly behind them. The cafeteria was spacious compared to the dorm rooms, with several tables and chairs scattered throughout the area. Vending machines lined one wall, while a small kitchen with microwaves and a refrigerator occupied another corner. "We need to secure the doors," George said, already moving to push a heavy table toward the entrance they'd just come through. The group quickly divided the tasks, dragging furniture to block both the stairwell door and the emergency exit on the opposite side of the cafeteria. As they finished piling chairs against the stairwell door, Brandon's phone suddenly burst to life, the ringtone shattering the relative quiet. Everyone froze, staring at him as he fumbled to pull the device from his pocket. "Hello?" he answered, his voice tense. "Brandon, is that you?" came a hesitant male voice. "Yeah, who's this?" Brandon replied, pressing the phone tighter to his ear. "It's Seth. From down the hall, room 710? The voice grew stronger with recognition. "I heard your voice earlier when you guys were in the hall, but I was too scared to open my door." Brandon's expression softened with relief. "Seth, are you okay? Are you bitten?" "No, I'm fine," Seth assured him. "I've been locked in my room since everything went crazy. Where are you guys?" "We're in the cafeteria on the 10th floor," Brandon explained. "We've secured it as best we can." "Can I come up?" Seth asked, hope evident in his voice. "I don't want to be alone anymore." Brandon moved to the stairwell door, pressing his ear against it. The sounds of moans and shuffling footsteps had returned, echoing in the concrete shaft. "I don't think that's a good idea right now," Brandon replied reluctantly. "The stairwell isn't safe. Do you have food?" "Not much," Seth admitted. "Just some chips and a bottle of water." Brandon thought for a moment. "Open your window. We'll see if we can see you." He moved to the windows lining the far wall of the cafeteria, the others following curiously. Looking down, they could see several windows on the 7th floor, one of which now had a figure leaning out, waving frantically. "I see you," Brandon confirmed over the phone. "Hang tight." He turned to the group. "We need to get him some supplies. Any ideas?" Deborah looked around the cafeteria, spotting a small wicker basket near the microwave station. "We could lower that down to him with some food." "But with what?" Pamela asked. George snapped his fingers. "The lost and found box. There should be scarves and stuff we can tie together." Within minutes, they had assembled a makeshift rope from several scarves and belts found in the lost and found bin by the entrance. They filled the basket with snack foods from the vending machines, which Aiden opened up with a firm swing of his fire extinguisher, and added a couple of bottles of water. Brandon carefully lowered the basket down to Seth, who reached out eagerly to grab it. "Is that enough to last you the night?" Brandon asked over the phone, which he'd set on speaker. "Yes, thank you," Seth replied, though his voice betrayed his continued fear. "Are you sure I can't come up? I could make a run for it." Brandon exchanged glances with the others before responding. "It's too risky right now. Those things are in the stairwell. Stay put, keep your door locked, and we'll figure something out in the morning if help hasn't arrived by then." Seth's disappointed acceptance was clear, but he agreed to stay put. After ensuring he had everything he needed for the night, Brandon ended the call, a troubled expression crossing his face. "How many others do you think are still alive in their rooms?" Deborah asked, giving voice to what they were all wondering. "Could be dozens," George replied. "Maybe more." "We should try to contact them," Pamela suggested. "Let them know they're not alone." Everyone pulled out their phones, each dialing numbers of friends, whether they lived in the building or not. Several of the calls went straight to voicemail or returned busy signals. Most, however, resulted in a high-pitched whine, signaling circuits overloading. After several minutes of failed attempts, George suddenly straightened up. "I need a pen and paper," he announced. Rocco rummaged through an abandoned backpack near one of the tables, producing a notebook and pen. "Here," he said, handing them over. George immediately began writing, jotting down names and numbers in neat columns that filled the page. "What are you doing?" Aiden asked, peering over his shoulder. "Making a list of every student who lives in this building," George explained. "As a dorm manager, I have access to the resident database. If the phone lines are too congested for calls, maybe text messages will get through." Brandon's face lit up with understanding. "That's brilliant, George." "We should divide the list," George continued, tearing out pages and handing them around. 20 numbers per person. Send a simple message letting them know where we are and that they should stay put until morning. For the next hour, they worked through their assigned numbers, sending out text after text. Responses trickled in slowly, some expressing relief, others panic, many asking for help that the group couldn't provide. They did what they could, offering reassurance, even if it included a dash of false hope that everything was going to be all right. As the texting marathon wound down, exhaustion began to settle over the group. The adrenaline that had carried them through the night's horrors was fading, leaving behind bone-deep weariness. "We need to get some rest," Brandon suggested, surveying their makeshift fortress. "But we should set up watches to make sure those doors stay secure." 2-hour shifts, Aiden agreed. 2 people per shift so they can keep each other awake and watch both doors. "I'll take the first shift," Deborah volunteered. "Me too," Brandon added quickly, perhaps a bit too eagerly. Aiden gave him a knowing look but said nothing. They arranged sleeping spots using cushions from the chairs and the few blankets they'd found in the lost and found. Within minutes, the exhausted survivors were settling in, the events of the night catching up with them all at once. As the others drifted into uneasy sleep, Brandon and Deborah positioned themselves near the doors, maintaining a vigilant watch. For a while they sat in companionable silence, the weight of their responsibility keeping them alert despite their fatigue. "Thank you," Deborah said suddenly, her voice soft in the dim light. Brandon turned to her, a hint of confusion in his voice. "For what?" "Saving me," she replied simply, "when that car came through the window. If you hadn't pulled me back—" She left the sentence unfinished, the implication clear. "I just reacted," Brandon admitted. "I'm glad you're okay." Another silence stretched between them, this one more charged than before. Brandon fidgeted with the edge of his shirt, gathering his courage. "You know, I've had a crush on you for months," he confessed suddenly, immediately regretting the words as they left his mouth. Sorry, that was probably not the best timing. To his surprise, Deborah smiled, a small, tired smile, but genuine nonetheless. "I suspected as much," she replied. "The way you'd always look away when I caught you staring in class." Heat rose to Brandon's cheeks. "Was I that obvious?" "Pretty much," she confirmed, her smile widening slightly before fading. "It's sweet, Brandon, really. But with everything that's happening," she gestured vaguely at their surroundings. "I know," he said quickly. "Bad timing. Forget I said anything." I didn't say that, Deborah corrected gently. Just, let's focus on surviving first, okay? Brandon nodded, understanding completely. They fell back into silence, though the tension between them had shifted into something more comfortable. As the night deepened around them, Deborah's shoulder pressed against his, her head eventually finding its way to rest against him. Brandon remained still, not wanting to disturb her, even as his arm began to tingle with pins and needles. Chapter 6. The first light of dawn crept through the windows of the 10th floor cafeteria, casting long shadows across the room. Aiden and Pamela sat on the floor, their backs pressed against each other as they maintained their vigilant watch over the two stairwell doors on opposite ends of the space. Throughout the night, they had heard moaning and the occasional door slamming somewhere in the building, but thankfully no zombies had attempted to breach their sanctuary. I'd be getting ready for econ right now, Pamela said softly, breaking a long silence between them. Professor Davis always locks the door exactly at 8. Aiden chuckled, the sound oddly normal in their abnormal circumstances. I'd be sleeping through my first alarm, probably wouldn't drag myself out of bed until 8:30 for my 9 a.m. physics lab. So you're one of those students, Pamela teased, a hint of her old self breaking through the tension of the past several hours. Hey, I show up. That's more than some can say, Aiden defended himself. He shifted slightly, careful not to disturb their back-to-back arrangement. What do you think is happening out there? Beyond campus, I mean. Pamela sighed. Nothing good. If what's happening here is happening everywhere. She didn't finish the thought. She didn't need to. The implications were clear enough. Their conversation was interrupted by the sounds of stirring around them as the others began to wake. Brandon was the first to rise, rubbing sleep from his eyes as he untangled himself from the makeshift bed he'd created from chair cushions. Deborah followed, stretching her arms above her head before running fingers through her tangled hair. Rocco and George took longer to fully wake, both groaning as they adjusted to the uncomfortable reality of their situation. George, ever practical, made his way to the small kitchenette area where he began preparing coffee in a large industrial pot. The smell of brewing coffee soon filled the cafeteria, providing a small sense of normalcy. Any trouble overnight? Brandon asked, approaching Aiden and Pamela. All quiet on the western front, Aiden replied, standing up and rolling his shoulders to work out the stiffness. Heard some moaning and door slamming, but nothing tried to get in here. Everyone instinctively checked their phones, hoping against hope for some sign of rescue or information from the outside world. A few had received scattered text messages from other students still barricaded in their rooms, but most had received no response to the messages they'd sent out the night before. Still no service, Rocco muttered, shoving his phone back in his pocket. You'd think, with something this big, there'd be emergency broadcasts or something. Maybe there are, George suggested, pouring himself the first cup of coffee, but we can't receive them. Brandon walked over to the window, peering down at the campus below. The morning light revealed more clearly the devastation that had occurred overnight. An overturned car lay in the middle of the quad, its windows shattered. Dark stains that could only be blood marked the pavement in several places. A handful of zombies wandered aimlessly across the open spaces, occasionally pausing as if listening for potential prey. What do you see? Deborah asked, joining him at the window. Nothing good, Brandon replied grimly, but it's hard to get a full picture from just this side. George approached them, coffee in hand, patting his pockets absently before his expression brightened. I've got my master keys, he announced. There's a maintenance access to the roof. We might get a better view from up there. The prospect of seeing the full extent of their situation drew everyone's attention. They waited impatiently as George poured cups of coffee for the rest of the group, distributing them before leading the way to a nondescript door in the corner of the cafeteria. I didn't even notice that before, Rocco remarked as George unlocked it, revealing a narrow maintenance closet with a ladder bolted to the far wall. Most people don't, George replied, pocketing his keys. It's not for student use, but under the circumstances. One by one, they climbed the metal ladder, emerging onto the flat roof of Dormitory Hall B. The morning air was cool and surprisingly fresh compared to the stale atmosphere inside. On any other day, the view would have been breathtaking. The campus spread out before them, the mountains rising majestically in the distance beyond the town. Today, however, the panorama revealed only horror. They spread out across the rooftop, each taking in the view from different angles. To the east, smoke rose from several buildings in town. To the north, the academic quad was littered with abandoned backpacks and occasional dark shapes that could only be bodies. To the west, the parking lots held cars with doors flung open. Some crashed into each other in what must have been desperate attempts to escape. "My God," Pamela whispered, her hand covering her mouth. "It's everywhere." Brandon moved to the southern edge of the roof, looking down at the neighboring dormitory buildings. What he saw there made his heart sink even further. A large mass of zombies pressed against the front entrance of Dormitory Hall A, pounding relentlessly on the doors and windows. In several windows above, makeshift signs had been hung, sheets with "help" written in what looked like marker or paint. "Guys," he called out, waving the others over, "look at this." They gathered along the southern edge, taking in the grim scene below. More signs could be seen in other windows across campus, desperate pleas from survivors trapped just as they were. "We can't help them," George said softly, voicing what they all knew but didn't want to accept. "We can barely help ourselves." The weight of this reality settled over the group as they stood in silence, soaking in the scene below. The understanding that no help was coming, that they truly were on their own, was becoming impossible to ignore. Eventually, they made their way back down the ladder, the somber mood following them like a shadow. Back in the cafeteria, they gathered around one of the tables, fresh coffee in hand. "We need to take stock of what we have," Brandon suggested, trying to focus on practical matters. "Food, water, supplies." George nodded, unlocking the storage room adjacent to the kitchenette. Inside, they found shelves stocked with non-perishable items: ramen noodles, canned soups, packaged snacks, and bottled water. It was far more than they had initially hoped for. "This is restocked every week," George explained. "They keep it well supplied for late-night study sessions and weekends." Aiden began counting and cataloging their supplies, while Rocco helped organize everything into categories. After about 20 minutes, they had a fairly comprehensive inventory. "If we're careful," Aiden announced, "we have enough to last us about a month, maybe longer if we really stretch it." "That's just for the 7 of us, including Seth," Pamela pointed out. "If we start bringing more people up here—" Her words were cut short by a shout from outside. Brandon rushed to the window, looking down to see Seth, waving frantically from his 7th-floor window. "Brandon," Seth called up, his voice barely audible across the distance. "What's happening? Did help come?" Brandon shook his head grimly. "Nothing yet," he called back. "We might be on our own for a while." Seth's shoulders slumped visibly. "The banging on my door is driving me crazy," he shouted. "I can't take another day of this. Please, let me come up there." Brandon turned back to the group who had gathered behind him at the window. "We have to help him," he said. "How?" Rocco asked. "The stairwells are crawling with those things." "Maybe we could create a diversion," Aiden suggested. "Draw them to one stairwell while Seth runs up the other." "Too risky," George countered. "Those creatures are fast, and they're everywhere. He'd never make it all the way up." "So what, we just leave him down there?" Deborah challenged. George was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then his expression changed, a spark of inspiration lighting his eyes. "The fire hose," he said suddenly. "On the roof." "What about it?" Brandon asked. "It's long," George explained. "Really long. Building code requires it to be able to reach all parts of the top couple floors. We might be able to lower it down to him." "And pull him up?" Aiden considered the idea. "That could work." "It's worth a try," Brandon agreed. George, Brandon, and Aiden quickly headed back to the roof, locating the fire hose cabinet near the access ladder. They broke the glass and began pulling out the thick canvas hose, uncoiling it across the rooftop. "We need to see how far it reaches," George said, feeding one end toward the edge of the building. Brandon and Aiden carefully lowered the nozzle end over the side, watching as it descended past floor after floor. To their relief, it extended well past the 7th floor, reaching nearly to the 5th. "This will work," Brandon said, pulling the hose back up. "Let's get into position." They stretched the hose along the edge of the roof directly above Seth's window. Brandon leaned over, calling down to him. "Seth, we're going to lower a fire hose down to you. We'll pull you up." Seth's face paled visibly, even from the distance. Climb up? Are you serious? You won't have to climb, Brandon reassured him. Just wrap it around yourself tightly under your arms and we'll do the pulling, like a harness. Seth looked unconvinced but nodded reluctantly. Okay, I'm ready when you are. The three men carefully lowered the hose, watching as it descended past the 10th floor, then the 9th, 8th, and finally reached Seth's window. He reached out cautiously, grabbing the nozzle and pulling it inside. He's got it, Aiden confirmed. Now we wait. It took several minutes for Seth to secure himself, during which they braced themselves against the roof edge, maintaining a firm grip on the hose. Finally, a tug from below signaled he was ready. On 3, Brandon instructed. 1, 2, 3. They began pulling in unison, the muscles in their arms and backs straining with the effort. The hose grew taut, taking Seth's full weight as they hoisted him upward. It's working, George grunted, his face red with exertion. Inch by inch, they pulled Seth up the side of the building. Occasionally, panicked shouts drifted up from below as he swung slightly, but they maintained a steady pace. As Seth approached the 10th floor, Brandon called down to the cafeteria window. He's almost there. Get ready to pull him in. Inside, Rocco, Deborah, and Pamela had opened the window as wide as possible, leaning out with outstretched arms. When Seth finally reached their level, they grabbed onto him, hauling him through the window with collective relief. On the roof, Brandon, Aiden, and George collapsed to the concrete surface, their arms trembling from the exertion. Sweat poured down their faces despite the cool morning air, but their expressions were triumphant. We did it, Aiden panted, a smile breaking across his face. We actually did it. Not bad for a bunch of college kids, George added, flexing his hands to work out the cramps. Brandon laughed, the sound born more of relief than humor. One rescue successful. As they sat catching their breath, celebrating their accomplishment, a new sound reached their ears, more voices calling from below. The three exchanged worried glances before rising to their feet and moving to the edge of the building. What they saw made their moment of triumph evaporate instantly. At least half a dozen students had stuck their heads out of windows on various floors, all calling up to them, having witnessed Seth's successful rescue. Their voices overlapped in a chorus of desperate pleas. Help us, please. I'm alone down here. My roommate is sick. I need to get out. I'm running out of food. Don't leave me here. Brandon, Aiden, and George stood frozen at the edge, the weight of responsibility suddenly crushing down on them. The realization that they couldn't save everyone, that choices would have to be made, settled over them like a dark cloud, eclipsing their brief moment of victory. Chapter 7. Seth sat on one of the couches that had been dragged from the lounge area, hungrily slurping down a cup of hot ramen noodles, his first proper meal since this nightmare began. The others were scattered around the space, nursing cups of coffee as they contemplated their next move. We can't just leave them down there, Deborah insisted, her voice breaking the heavy silence that had settled over the group. Brandon ran a hand through his hair, exhaustion evident in the dark circles forming under his eyes. The fire hose can reach the 6th floor, maybe the 5th if we stretch it. That means we can get to 2 more people based on where they're located. Just 2? George asked, his expression grim. The hose isn't long enough to reach the others, Brandon confirmed. And that's just on this side of the building. We don't even know how many might be trapped on the other sides. Rocco paced nervously by the window, occasionally glancing down at the desperate faces looking up at them. So we save 2 and leave the rest to die? How do we choose? We don't, Aiden said firmly. We save who we can now and figure out a way to get to the others. Pamela, who had been quiet since they returned from the roof, spoke up. What about the stairwells? If we could clear one, maybe we could bring people up that way. The suggestion hung in the air, simultaneously hopeful and terrifying. Fighting their way down a stairwell filled with zombies was a risk none of them were eager to take, but the alternative, leaving fellow students to die, was equally unpalatable. I say we use the hose to get the 2 we can reach while we figure out what to do about the rest, Aiden suggested pragmatically. At least that's 2 more people safe. Brandon, Aiden, and George returned to the roof, the process of rescuing 2 more students taking nearly an hour. The physical toll of pulling people up was substantial, leaving all three men with trembling arms and aching backs. Back in the cafeteria, the expanded group once again turned to the problem of those still trapped below. "We need to clear one of the stairwells," Brandon said decisively. "It's the only way to reach everyone else." "With what?" Deborah challenged. "A fire extinguisher and some chair legs? Against who knows how many of those things?" "The mattress worked well before," Brandon pointed out. "I can hold them back while others take them out." "Until one slips past, or there's too many to hold," Deborah countered. "It's too dangerous." "So is leaving those people down there to starve," Rocco argued. The debate continued, voices rising as tension mounted. Some advocated for immediate action, others for caution, while still others suggested alternative approaches that quickly proved impractical. As the discussion devolved into crosstalk, Brandon's patience finally snapped. He slammed his hand down on the table, the sharp crack silencing everyone instantly. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low but intense. "If we don't do something, we're condemning those students to a slow, painful starvation death. We have to assume that no help is coming, at least not soon enough. I don't like the idea of fighting those things any more than you do, but I don't see another option." His words hung in the air, the brutal truth of their situation impossible to ignore. "He's right," George finally said. "We can't just leave them down there." One by one, the others reluctantly nodded their agreement. The decision had been made. They would attempt to clear a stairwell. "We need a plan," Aiden said, immediately focusing on practicalities. "And weapons." Brendan nodded. "I'll take the mattress again for defense. Aiden, Rocco, you two are our best fighters. You'll be the attackers." The two men nodded, understanding the roles they would play. "What about the rest of us?" Pamela asked. "You stay here and maintain the barricade," Brendan replied. "If things go sideways, you'll need to be ready to defend this position." They set about preparing for the dangerous mission. Aiden and Rocco each took a knife from the kitchen area, giving them practice swings just in case they had a close encounter. For more substantial weapons, they broke apart a heavy wooden chair, the thick legs making serviceable clubs. George and Deborah each took one as well, just in case the zombies breached their defenses. Brandon moved to the window, looking down at the students trapped on the 6th floor. 3 young women were visible, spread out in rooms on either end of the building. "We're coming down," he called out. "When you hear me call from the stairwell on your floor, run for it. Don't hesitate, don't grab anything, just run." The women nodded enthusiastically, relief evident even from a distance. Other voices called up from below, desperate pleas from students on lower floors. "We'll come back for you," Brandon promised. "Just hold on a little longer." Back inside, the rescue team gathered by the stairwell door. Brandon positioned himself with the mattress, ready to use it as a shield. Aiden and Rocco flanked him, their makeshift weapons clutched tightly. "Ready?" Brandon asked, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "As will ever be," Aiden replied. Brandon nodded to George, who pushed open the door. Immediately, 3 zombies lunged toward the opening, their vacant eyes locking onto fresh prey. Brandon thrust the mattress forward, catching the lead zombie in the chest, holding it in place in the doorway. "Now!" he shouted. Aiden lunged forward, swinging his chair leg with devastating force. The heavy wood connected with the pinned zombie's skull, caving it in with a sickening crack. As the creature slumped to the ground, Rocco engaged the second, catching it under the chin with his makeshift club. The impact snapped its head back with enough force to break its neck, though the creature continued to struggle until Aiden delivered the killing blow to its head. The third zombie clawed at the mattress, trying to reach around it to get to Brandon. Rocco grabbed its arm, yanking it sideways and exposing its head. With brutal efficiency, he brought his club down, ending the threat instantly. The 3 men stood tense, breathing heavily as they waited for more attackers. When none appeared, they exchanged cautious looks of relief. "Let's move," Brandon said, stepping fully into the stairwell. "Wait," Deborah called from the doorway. "I'm coming with you." "No," Brandon insisted. "You need to stay here and guard the door." Deborah shook her head stubbornly. "I'll guard it from this side. Someone needs to make sure you can get back in if things go wrong." Brandon hesitated, then nodded. "All right. But if it looks like we're not going to make it back, you close this door. Promise me." "I promise," she replied, giving Brandon a slight nod. Brandon, Aiden, and Rocco began their descent, moving cautiously down to the 9th floor landing. So far, the stairwell was clear, but none of them were foolish enough to believe it would stay that way. "We should block the doors as we go," Aiden suggested, "in case some of those things on the other side hear us." "Good thinking," Brandon agreed. "Last thing we need is to be attacked from behind." Aiden and Rocco returned to the 10th floor, dragging 2 of the zombie corpses down to the 9th floor landing. They positioned the bodies in front of the door, creating a makeshift barrier that would at least slow down anything trying to get through from the other side. They repeated the process on the 8th floor, the stairwell remaining eerily quiet as they worked. By the time they reached the 6th floor, the tension had wound them tight as springs. "This is where it gets real," Brandon muttered, adjusting his grip on the mattress. They took their positions by the door, the routine now familiar. Brandon would block, Aiden and Rocco would strike. On a silent count of 3, they pulled the door open. The response was immediate. A zombie, what had once been a young man in a university sweatshirt, lunged through the opening, arms outstretched and teeth bared. Brandon caught it with the mattress, forcing it back against the doorframe. Rocco reached around the mattress, grabbing the creature's arm and yanking it into the stairwell with surprising strength. Before it could recover, Aiden delivered a powerful kick to its side, sending it tumbling down the stairs. It landed awkwardly on the landing below, its neck twisting at an unnatural angle. Though the fall would have killed a living person instantly, the zombie continued to move, trying to rise despite its broken body. "They really don't die easily," Rocco muttered, descending a few steps to deliver the killing blow to its head. "There's more coming," Brandon warned, spotting movement down the 6th floor hallway. He quickly repositioned the mattress to block the doorway as 2 more zombies rushed toward them. They slammed against the barrier, their hands clawing at the edges as they tried to reach the fresh meat just beyond. Aiden and Rocco moved with practiced efficiency now, taking turns dispatching the creatures as Brandon held them at bay. The 3rd went down just as a 4th appeared at the far end of the hallway, drawn by the commotion. As the others had done, the creature broke into a sprint as soon as he spotted them, covering the distance with terrifying speed. Aiden waited, his expression grim, until the zombie was close enough. Then he swung his club with all his might, the impact making a sound like a watermelon being dropped on concrete. The ghoul collapsed instantly, finally at peace. The 3 students stood in the doorway, a 1,000-yard stare etched on their faces as their attention remained focused on the hallway. They waited for any signs of movement, relieved that nothing else seemed to be alive or undead. "All right, girls, make a run for it right now," Brandon yelled out down the hallway, his voice echoing against the walls of the empty corridor. Within seconds, several doors flung open, 3 young women sprinting down the hallway as fast as they could move. The 3 men stood at the ready in the stairwell doorway, ready to pounce at the slightest signs of trouble, but none came as the girls made their way to them. When they got close, Brandon stood up, moving the mattress so that they could pass. "Thank you so much." "I don't know how to thank you," one of the girls said, her emotions getting the best of her. "We're just doing what we can to help. Now get up to the 10th floor, Brandon replied with a friendly nod. The girls, for their part, didn't hesitate, immediately running up the stairs towards the cafeteria sanctuary above. The trio stood in the doorway for a moment, soaking in their little victory. While it was a drop in the bucket compared to what needed to be done, they wanted to savor their accomplishment. After several moments, Brandon broke the silence. "All right, that's 1 floor down. Let's keep moving." Chapter 8. Brandon, Aiden, and Rocco stood on the landing between the 6th and 5th floors, catching their breath after successfully evacuating the 3 women from the 6th floor. The rescue had gone smoothly, almost too smoothly, giving them a dangerous sense of confidence. From the other side of the 5th floor door came the unmistakable sounds of movement, shuffling feet, occasional thumps, and the distinctive moans they had all come to associate with the zombies. "There's a lot of them in there," Rocco whispered, pressing his ear against the door. He pulled back, his face grim. "Too many. We should head back up." Brandon shook his head. "I saw at least 5 rooms with people signaling for help on this floor. We can't turn back now." "Did you hear how many of those things are in there?" Rocco countered, his voice rising despite his effort to keep quiet. "We got lucky on the upper floors, but this is different." "We have to try," Brandon insisted. "If it's too much, we pull back. But we can't leave without at least attempting to reach them." Aiden stood between them, both literally and figuratively. "Rocco's right about the risk," he said cautiously, "but Brandon's right that we need to try. Those people are counting on us." Rocco ran a hand through his sweat-soaked hair, frustration evident in his expression. "This is a mistake," he muttered. "Noted," Brandon replied, his tone firm but not unkind. "But we're doing it anyway. Get in position." With reluctance, Rocco moved into place, gripping his makeshift weapon tightly. Aiden positioned himself on the opposite side, while Brandon readied the mattress shield. "On 3, Brandon said, his voice barely above a whisper. 1, 2, 3. Aiden pulled the door open, and Brandon immediately stepped forward, bracing the mattress against the surge he knew would come. The response was instantaneous and overwhelming. Bodies slammed against the barrier with enough force to drive Brandon back a step, the mattress bending alarmingly under the assault. "Jesus," Rocco breathed, his eyes widening at the sight of the mob pressing against the other side. Where previous floors had contained only a few scattered zombies, the 5th floor was teeming with them. At least a dozen were already pushing against the mattress, with more visible further down the hallway, turning toward the commotion. "Start swinging," Brandon shouted, his arms burning with the effort of holding back the press of bodies. Aiden and Rocco moved in tandem, their clubs rising and falling in brutal arcs. The first zombie went down, then the second and third, but the press of bodies behind them made it nearly impossible to create any space. Each fallen creature simply became an obstacle for Brandon to hold up, along with the mattress, the dead weight making his task increasingly difficult. "There's too many," Rocco yelled, his weapon making a sickening crunch as it connected with another skull. "Keep going," Brandon urged, his feet sliding slightly on the smooth concrete floor as the pressure continued to build. They fought with desperate intensity, managing to take down 5 zombies in short order, but the situation was rapidly deteriorating. For each creature they felled, another seemed to take its place, drawn by the noise of the struggle. Then, without warning, a new sound cut through the chaos, the metallic bang of a door flying open somewhere below them, followed by the panicked screams of a student. "Help! Somebody help me!" The voice carried up the stairwell raw with terror, only to be joined seconds later by the hungry moans of pursuing zombies and the thunder of footfalls on concrete steps. Hayden risked a glance down the stairwell, his face paling at what he saw. "We've got incoming." 2 floors below, a male student was being overwhelmed by 3 zombies, their hands grasping at his clothes as he tried desperately to fend them off. Behind them, more creatures poured through the doorway, immediately drawn to the commotion above. "We've got to move," Aiden shouted, turning back to continue fighting the zombies at the 5th floor entrance. Brandon's arms trembled with exertion, the mattress becoming impossibly heavy as more dead weight pressed against it. "Fall back to the next landing," he ordered. "I need room to maneuver." Aiden and Rocco complied, retreating up a few steps to give Brandon space. He began backpedaling up the stairs, using the mattress as a mobile barricade. The zombies followed, pushing against the barrier with relentless determination, their dead eyes fixed on the prey just beyond their reach. Brandon made it halfway up the next flight of stairs when disaster struck. His foot, slick with sweat and blood, slipped on the concrete step. He pitched backward, the mattress momentarily dropping from its defensive position. "Brandon!" Aiden shouted, lunging down to grab his friend's arm. Aiden's grip was strong, arresting Brandon's fall and pulling him back upright. The moment of vulnerability was brief, but it was enough for the lead zombie to lunge forward, narrowly missing Brandon's exposed leg. Rocco, seeing his friends in danger, stepped down to help. He swung his chair leg with all his might, connecting with the lead zombie's head and sending it tumbling back down the stairs. But the force of his swing pulled him off balance, his foot slipping just as Brandon's had moments before. What happened next seemed to unfold in horrifying slow motion. Rocco teetered on the edge of the step, arms pinwheeling as he fought to regain his balance. A zombie from below reached up, its fingers clamping around Rocco's ankle with terrible strength. With a yank, it pulled the young man further off balance. "Rocco!" Brandon screamed, watching helplessly as his friend toppled forward, plunging headfirst into the mob of creatures on the landing below. Rocco's scream was cut short as he disappeared beneath a wave of grasping hands and gnashing teeth. Blood sprayed across the walls as the zombies tore into him with savage intensity. No! Aiden shouted, taking a step toward his fallen friend. Brandon grabbed Aiden by the shirt, yanking him back with desperate strength. We can't help him. We have to go now. One zombie broke away from the feeding frenzy, its attention drawn to the fresh prey above. It scrambled up the stairs, mouth open in a hungry snarl. Aiden, grief and rage contorting his features, hurled his chair leg at the creature. The makeshift weapon struck it squarely in the face, knocking it backward into the tangle of bodies below. Run! Brandon yelled, abandoning the mattress as he and Aiden sprinted up the stairs. They took the steps 2 and 3 at a time, adrenaline giving them speed they didn't know they possessed. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder as more zombies broke away from Rocco's body to give chase. As they rounded the final landing, they saw Deborah standing guard at the 10th floor door, her face lighting up with relief at their approach. That relief quickly turned to confusion, then horror, as she realized Rocco wasn't with them. "Where's?" she began. "He's gone," Aiden cut her off, grabbing her arm and pulling her into the cafeteria. "They got him." "No!" Deborah gasped, her eyes filling with tears. Brandon slammed the door shut behind them, the others rushing to help barricade it once more. They piled tables, chairs, and anything else they could find against the entrance, working with frantic energy as the first zombies reached the landing outside. Within moments, the pounding began, fists hammering against metal, hungry moans filtering through the barrier. But the door held, the makeshift barricade doing its job. As the immediate danger passed, the reality of what had happened crashed down on them. Rocco was gone, torn apart before their eyes. Brandon slumped against the wall, sliding down until he was sitting on the floor. His hands trembled uncontrollably, still feeling the phantom weight of the mattress. Blood, some his own, most from the creatures he'd fought, covered his clothes in dark, sticky patches. "It's my fault," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I pushed to go down there. Rocco didn't want to, but I pushed." Deborah knelt beside him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You were trying to save people," she said softly. "Rocco understood that. He was helping because he believed in what you were doing." Brandon shook his head, unable to accept her comfort. "We should have turned back. He was right, there were too many." Around them, the survivors they had rescued watched in silence, their expressions a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. They owed their lives to these students, one of whom had paid the ultimate price for their safety. After several moments, Brandon finally looked up, his eyes meeting the gazes of those he had saved. 9 people, 9 lives that would have been lost without their intervention. It didn't make Rocco's death any easier to bear, but it gave it meaning, purpose. With a deep breath, Brandon pushed himself to his feet. "Get comfortable," he told the rescued students, his voice steadier than he felt. "Get something to eat. We'll figure out our next steps soon." Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked to the maintenance closet, climbing the ladder to the roof. He needed air, space, a moment away from the weight of expectations and grief. Deborah and Aiden exchanged worried glances before following him up, giving him just enough time to be alone with his thoughts. The afternoon sun was in full bloom, casting long shadows across the campus below. From this height, the devastation was stark. Abandoned vehicles, scattered bodies, small groups of zombies wandering aimlessly or converging on some unseen target. Smoke still rose from several buildings in the distance, and the sounds of occasional screams carried on the wind. Brandon stood at the edge of the roof, his hands gripping the low wall that ran around its perimeter. His shoulders shook with silent sobs as he finally allowed himself to break down, the events of the past 12 hours crashing over him like a tidal wave. He heard the soft footsteps behind him, but didn't turn. Deborah's hand slipped into his, her fingers intertwining with his own. On his other side, Aiden placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, a gesture of silent support. "There wasn't anything we could have done for him," Aiden said quietly, his own voice thick with emotion. "It happened too fast." "I know," Brandon replied, wiping his eyes with his free hand. I keep seeing it. He was right there, and then he was gone." "He died helping others," Deborah said softly. "That means something." Brandon nodded, unable to find words. They stood in silence for several minutes, looking out over the ruins of their familiar world. Everything had changed in a single night. Friends lost, safety shattered, the future suddenly uncertain in ways none of them could have imagined. "What do we do now?" Brandon finally asked, voicing the question that weighed on all their minds. Deborah squeezed his hand, her touch grounding him in the moment. "We do the only thing we can do," she replied, her voice gentle but firm. "We wait. We take care of each other. We survive." Brandon pulled Deborah closer, wrapping his arm around her shoulder. He knew she was right. The only thing they could do was wait. The end.